we're going to be talking about esports leagues for women. Because recently, this has been a topic of discussion and I wanted to cover it. I've actually wanted to cover this topic for a long time and I never had the balls to talk about it because I figured it's so controversial, I might get canceled if I talk about it. Even though, in my opinion, I have a I think I have a very reasonable mindset about it. But yeah, people are gonna get triggered by this, so I guess maybe I should say that first. If you're easily offended and you're like, you might not want to watch this. So yeah, here we go. We're gonna be talking about esports leagues for women. The reason why I want to finally talk about this is because this is something that finally came up within Capcom. Capcom has announced they're gonna be looking into, and as far as I can tell, this is not like finalized planning or anything like that, but they are planning to put up a league specifically for women. And this is a hot topic for a lot of different reasons, and there are so many angles to cover. Like, for example, trans women. How do they fit in this discussion, right? That can be a whole separate video. So I'm not sure if I want to go into that. I guess we'll see about that, dependent on how long we're going to be talking about it. Here's the thing. Let's start off with a simple question. What is the motivation behind the Women Esports League? Obviously, the motivation is kind of clear and, like, if you don't think about it too much, seems like makes a lot of sense. You don't see a lot of women in the FGC, so why not support them and give them a platform, essentially, right? Because they basically have no visibility at the moment. So Capcom wants to support that, and I think in principle the idea that, well, let's support women in the FGC, obviously there's nothing wrong with that, and that's the idea behind it, right? But there are a lot of different angles to this, and there are a lot of implications that there are when you do something like that. I think you can make a good argument for why this actually hurts women in the FGC, because first of all, you're making the stereotype of like women being bad players even worse by doing this, because you're basically saying, because that's heavily implied, right? You're basically saying women can't compete in regular leagues, so they need their own thing. And when do we do that? I mean, we do that, and like Chad has pointed that out as well, right? We do that in sports. And why do we do that in sports? I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? We do that in sports because there's a physical element to that. Women cannot compete with men in physical competitions simply because of biological differences. And because of that, we have two separate categories. And that makes a lot of sense. And that is absolutely necessary, obviously. And now when we get to esports, the question is that the same thing? And here's where it kind of gets tricky, to be honest, because a lot of women in particular, or not just women really, a lot of people will make the argument that, well, it is necessary to have women's leagues because women have it so tough in the FGC because they get no respect whatsoever. So in order to make up for this disadvantage that is created by, let's say, the toxic community, they have to get their own league so they can get the spotlight, so they can create opportunities for themselves, like sponsorships, for example, right? That's a very common argument that I hear, and I want to talk about that because I think it's a weak argument, and there's some data to support that this is a weak argument. First of all, sometimes I hear TOs talk about how we have to create a better space for tournaments so that females feel comfortable coming to tournaments, because like sometimes I really hear this. I hear people saying that we have a lot of females in the community, but they're scared to come out to tournaments because of whatever, harassment or whatever, right? And I think that is very disingenuous already, because the data suggests that this is not the case at all. If I take a look at my YouTube channel, this is kind of funny because I can just take a look at my own data and see that this is not the case. If there were even close to, if there were so many women interested in Street Fighter in the first place, I would see that in my own YouTube analytics, right? And I can tell you this is not the case. On YouTube, about 1% of my audience is female. The rest are all male. And it actually took a while to go from 100% male to even 1% female. The first couple of it took me like I needed a couple of thousand subscribers on YouTube to even go from 100% to a tiny a tiny bit of female audience. And I've even confirmed this with even bigger channels, because I figured, okay, maybe that's just a coincidence, right? Maybe I don't know, people just happen to come to my channel, and like maybe my channel happens to be male oriented. But it's not the case. Even bigger content creators than myself, I've confirmed with them directly, and I've never heard a figure beyond 3%. So it's between 1 and 3% normally. And those are creators who are not even doing just Street Fighter stuff. They're like doing everything within the FGC essentially, and stuff outside of the FGC. And that's kind of interesting to me, because if you're gonna make the argument that, well, women like would be interested in the FGC if they didn't get harassed at tournaments, well, that's not how it works. Like, if there is genuine interest, you would see that in how many women watch this stuff in the first place, right? And there's really no barrier there at all, right? So you cannot make that argument. You cannot argue that women are just not participating because they get harassed. Because the first step is really, you get interested because of, well, let's say a friend of yours is interested in the FGC, or you watched Evo or whatever. You generally don't start by going to tournaments. You get started by getting exposed to the FGC, either online or through a real life friend or something like that. And even then, the data is very clear on that. Women are not interested in Street Fighter. I'm not arguing against becoming part of the scene. I do think that women do have certain unique barriers in their way. I do think that's very obvious that this is the case. They're gonna face certain problems that are associated with being part of, well, a 1% within a certain group, right? I'm not saying they don't have a harder time, or they don't face, let's say, unique challenges, because they absolutely do. But here's the thing. Here's one thing that is also worth considering, okay? If you're part of the FGC, and let's say you wanna make a name for yourself, one thing that you have a really hard time with is standing out. Because if you wanna become part of the FGC, or if you wanna become part of any really for any community, and you want to make a name for yourself, you kind of need to stand out, right? And guess what? It's very, very easy to stand out within the FGC if you're a woman. It's very easy to get there, and that comes with some consequences that I see all the time. And I guess this transitions. Actually, I want to make a different point, but I guess it doesn't really matter. We can talk about that immediately. If you told me to compete in FGC but be full of Texas cops as a black man, I ain't playing. Yeah, and I think if that's what your concern is, Black Skills, if your concern is that there's a hostile environment, I don't think we're getting to a better environment if you open up leaks based on genders. I think that's actually going to backfire, and it's going to make the stereotypes even worse. Because people are going to look at this and they're going to be like, oh wow, we have women's league because women can't compete with men. It actually encourages this mindset, right? I think that's a big problem. It encourages the mindset of men and women can't compete equally in Street Fighter. And I think that's a big problem if that's the thing that we're promoting. And also, I think TOs are doing everyone a disservice by saying that we need to do better for women, because they're actively promoting the idea that the FGC is an extremely hostile environment for women, and that they basically shouldn't come here because they should be scared for their safety. If that's the kind of vibes that they're going to put out, how are women, like, how does that help with like making women feel welcome within the FGC? And here's the thing: if you're a woman in the FGC, you're going to have interactions that are unique problems to female streamers. But at the same time, you also have unique advantages. Like, for example, if you want to have a Twitch channel and you're part of the FGC and you're a woman, guess what? People are going to be way more likely to check you out. They're going to be way more likely to at least click on the stream, because that's your main problem that you have when you're trying to build a stream. You need to stand out. And as a woman in the FGC, you immediately stand out. So that's a benefit. They're definitely not just disadvantages. And as I said earlier, it goes a lot deeper than just saying, oh well, the FGC is a toxic place for women. No, it doesn't work like that. Like, it's not an FGC problem. It's really, if you're part of a 1%, you will have unique problems associated with that. And we can see that everywhere, essentially. If you're part of a minority group, then people are going to have, well, you're going to be put in there's a stereotype associated with that, right? For example, people will immediately think that you're not playing on high level if you're a woman in the FGC. But here's the thing. For the most part, that's true. It's not like a crazy assumption to make. And this is where people will start to make arguments like, oh, well, no, we shouldn't put people into boxes before we interact with them. And then I'm like, you do realize that the moment you see a person for the very first time, you immediately categorize the person. So that's not an FGC problem. Humans do that, and there's a good reason why humans do that. It's essentially a survival instinct, because you need to immediately understand if a person that you see is potentially a threat or not. That's why we categorize. You don't even think about it. And nobody can tell me that they don't. If someone is actually thinks that they don't do that, then I think they have a very bad look at themselves. Because you do that. Every single person that you see, you immediately categorize them. And that's not the problem. If you're interacting with, let's say you see a woman in the FGC that you've never seen, right? Your first assumption is maybe she's the girlfriend of a player here, which, guess what, happens to be true in a lot of cases. But sometimes you're going to be wrong about that, and you're going to figure that out very quickly, and you're going to adjust your assumptions based on that, just like any other normal human being. So I don't think that's the problem. I don't think that's a problem. If you don't want to be put into boxes, well, then you can't really interact with humans, because humans do that all the time. I don't categorize people when I first see them. It's just not true. You will do that. You will do that subconsciously. You don't have to think about that. You will do that subconsciously, especially when it comes to something that stands out. If something stands out, you immediately notice that. And it's a very normal human attribute. But here's the thing. Most of the time when something like this happens, we adjust categories that for people that we meet all the time based on the interactions that we have with them, right? Happens all the time. So yeah, that's a component, okay? I mean, that's just a very, very small component of what I want to talk about anyways. Girls get bullied when they beat men because they can't take losing. And here's the thing. If you break a stereotype, you will always get really interesting reactions. And I guess this is a good moment to talk about stuff like that, all right? Like, what happens when you break the expected outcome? Let's call it that. And I want to show you a tweet regarding this that I find really interesting. And we're basically going to go to something like confirmation bias is what happens in this instance. Like, take a look at this tweet from Luffy, okay? He said, I am as much harassed by stream monsters as women. When I get on stream, people like to shout Luffy or fake Evo champ. I'm crying every night when I come back home and watch the VODs, but I still have the courage to go to IRL events. Man up, girls. This is kind of an interesting tweet because, first of all, it's overblown, and the first statement, right away, you can't even know if this is true or not, right? We're gonna get into that topic as well in a second, like whether or not men get harassed as much as women, right? Interesting statement from Luffy right there. But it's a great point that he's making. When he got to be the Evo champ, what was the first thing that I heard? The first thing, literally, the first thing that I heard when Luffy became Evo champ, online there was a discussion about nerfing Rose. When was that? In 2014, right? When Luffy won Evo in 2014, people said that Luffy only won because he played a broken character. Why was that the case? Why was this the first thing that people said? But Rose was overpowered. There we go. We still have the same complaints, right? And here's the thing. Imagine if Luffy was a female player. Imagine Luffy was a female player and the same reactions came into place. Wouldn't people immediately point out sexism there? People would immediately point it out. The point that I want to make with like showing Luffy's message is that we're way more sensitive to reacting to and noticing stuff like that when it happens to minority groups. Like, people are way more sensitive to attacks on minority groups, right? But in reality, actually, it becomes a problem because if, like, nobody gives a shit about Luffy if he complained on Twitter and cried and said, "Nobody takes me seriously. Oh, I'm so sad." People would laugh at that, right? because we can know for sure, at least, it's not a sexism problem. And what would people say to Luffy if he actually cried about that and complained about it heavily on Twitter? People would just say, "Hey, dude, you're gonna have haters. You're gonna have fans if you accomplish anything. If you stand out in some way in any community, this is what's gonna happen. You're gonna have fans and you're gonna have haters, right? And if you give haters the ammunition to hurt you, if you say, 'Hey, I'm very sensitive,' if you say that, well, that's exactly what they want to hear. You're gonna have a troll community built around you if you do that." So here's the thing. The question really becomes, like, how can we even tell whether men or women, whether women have a harder time within the community if we don't even notice, like, when it happens to men? Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it, right? Because it's normal. It's totally normal to have haters. That's the thing that really bothers me a little bit, because this is confirmation bias. Like, when it happens to men, it flies under the radar, and it happens all the time to men, all the time. But when it happens to women, people will report on it, right? So we immediately get this impression that, oh wow, we have a harassment problem in our community, when that's not necessarily the case. And I'm not going to argue that we don't have a problem like that. My point is that it's really difficult to tell. I mean, Luffy was being ironic and sarcastic, but he made a great point. Obviously, he didn't mean that seriously, right? When he said, "I'm crying every night." But guess what? If you're gonna become the Evo champ and people say, "Well, it's because you played Rose," like, that's not something you want to hear. You want to, like, that's an amazing accomplishment, especially Luffy. Luffy got Evo champ from the craziest losers bracket run ever in a tournament, maybe. That's a huge accomplishment. That's a huge accomplishment. You can't even argue that he happened to run into good matchups from the winners bracket, and he didn't have that many matches to play. He literally went to losers bracket super early on, so he had to face more opponents, which makes it more likely for you to lose, obviously, right? So not only did he win Evo, but he won Evo in, like, the most difficult Evo run ever. So that's an accomplishment, and he didn't get that accomplishment. Why? But why, though? This is where I want to talk about the why. He didn't get it because he broke the perceived, like, norm, essentially. People expected a Japanese player to win, and that did not happen. So people immediately tried to make sense out of the situation. How could he possibly win even though he's not Japanese? And that's when we get into this, oh, it must be because he's playing a broken character. That's when people are going to make excuses. Whenever you break some kind of established norm, this is exactly what happens. And obviously, if you're a woman in the FGC and you start winning against strong players, that's exactly what happens. But guess what? That doesn't happen very often, because it's only 1% of the player base that is female in the first place. When MenRD won Capcom Cup, he immediately got the hate as well. This is kind of important to understand. This is a complicated topic, and I've seen some really stupid takes on it that oversimplify this issue to the point where like I really hate the sentiment that I sometimes read on Twitter, where people are like, oh, we, the FGC, we need to do better to support our women. Like, it's and like, in my opinion, this gender segregation thing that Capcom is going to try to do here, it's a slap in the face to competitive female players, because they're literally not being taken seriously. So yeah, that's something I'm really bothered by, to be honest. I also have like another example that I want to point out. Maybe I should show that first, because I found that really curious, because people lose their shit all the time when it comes to this topic, male versus female, and when there's not like a 50-50 split, right? When there's not a 50-50 split, people will immediately say there's something wrong. And I think that mindset is absolute cancer, because then you start to incorporate sexist policies into really everything, because you want to enforce the 50-50 split, even though the 50-50 split might just be a result of, well, different interests. I think people hate this thought that this is the case, even though it's so obvious that that's the case. Let's take a look at this one, okay? Unfortunately, the original tweet got deleted, but we can see what the tweet originally was, okay? So here it is. So I'm deleting that tweet because it's making Twitter unusable. But I want to be perfectly clear, esports need to get its act together and include women in professional competition. There is no physical reason women can't compete alongside men. And the last statement, she's absolutely right about that. But this is the mindset that I'm talking about, right? So esports somehow has an obligation to make sure there's a 50-50 split between men and women, okay? Like, because that's not the case, it means that the men are somehow scaring the women away. Like, that's the underlying argument, right? And then here's a counter statement from another woman. I think this is about the CS:GO community, but I could be wrong. Here's a response to to the initial tweet that said that well, sexism is a major issue and women aren't competing because it's too much of a toxic place, and etc. Right? And this is from a woman, thank God, that said the following: women are included. I've competed in 200 COED tournaments. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't really matter that much, right? Any woman can play in any event. Most don't care to. There was, and this is something that I've read about as well, there was a 150K women-only event in North America, and only 25 women care to enter. Even women's events have a participation issue. No one's stopping women from playing. And this is something that really, this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? Even if you make it women only, even if you, so you're completely removing the argument that, well, women don't want to bother with competing because they have to deal with the toxicity of the male players, right? Even if you remove that entirely, nothing changes. I think there was a CS:GO event with a 150K event that was open, but open to only women, and there was no participation essentially. I could be wrong on the CS:GO, by the way. I'm not sure if this is CS:GO. I think it was CS:GO, but I could be wrong. This is interesting, right? Because it completely annihilates this idea that women would like to participate and they're somehow they can't because of sexism, right? And this is where the argument becomes like stronger about well, women just not being interested in competitive games in a lot of times. I mean, that's not true to everyone, and this is also something where the argument really, like, someone tries to use a strawman argument against you. There are exceptions. There are obviously exceptions. There are women that are interested in competitive play, and they can compete, and they do compete. And once again, here the problem really is when does it, and unfortunately I don't really have a good example of that, but it becomes really difficult to judge whether you're being targeted because you established yourself in a community and now you have fans and haters, because guess what? I have haters all the time. I get messages on a daily basis about people not liking me. The good thing is I know it's not because I'm a man. I can be sure that I'm not being harassed because of my gender, right? Or I'm not in a special spot here. It's just how it is. If you're in a public space and you have a lot of people looking at you, you will hear some nasty stuff because there is no filter. When you read comments about you, then you will hear people's thoughts about you without a filter, and that can be devastating, and that can really hurt. I fully understand that. It's just that you won't get rid of that by calling, and not only will you not get rid of that by calling for a nicer place in any community, you're actually making it even worse by encouraging this thought process that women are especially targeted. This creates certain situations that I want to address as well, where women can't tell when someone criticizes you. And I've dealt with a lot of people in my life that are exactly like that, and it's not nice to deal with them because they're completely crazy. I want to show you something right here. This is a conversation between a game developer, a female game developer, and someone from within the community. This is Guild Wars 2. And take a look at this conversation, okay? So Jessica Price says something about MMORPGs, and like, it doesn't even matter exactly what she says, okay? But let's take a look at the response here and see what can happen and what happens all the time, which makes me really sad. So D-Rar comments here and says, really interesting thread to read. However, allow me to disagree slightly. I don't believe the issue lies in the MMORPG genre itself, as your wording seemingly suggests. I believe the issue lies in the constraints of the living story's narrative design. And like, it's a three-part message, right? So here's the thing. What would you consider this answer to be from this community member of Guild Wars 2? Would you consider this disrespectful, or like the intentions behind it? Is this in any way, does this cross a line? And I think if you're like a reasonable person, you would say no. This is just a normal conversation. It's very, very polite on top of that, by the way, which you don't have to do if you're in a conversation. You don't have to be super polite, but it is super polite. And like, let's take a look at her response to that. The response here is, today in being a female game dev, allow me, a person who does not work with you, explain to you how to do your job. Okay? So this is what I'm talking about. This is a prime example of when the whole world tells you that people will target you because you're a woman. Like, you see that in every conversation ever. And I've seen people do that, and people close to me have exactly this problem. You basically become a person that is like, you cannot ever take advice from anyone because you're so busy with the idea that the whole world is oppressing you that you can't have a normal conversation anymore. And this is an example that I want to put out. And once again, that does not mean that always happens. And like, it's really important to point out that yes, if you're a woman in a community in the FGC, you're going to have some unique challenges or unique encounters that can happen. And that's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate. But we kind of have to stay reasonable and ask ourselves, okay, how big is the problem really? And is it impossible for a woman to compete properly as a result? And I think we have the trans community to show us that this is not the case. It's something that I just barely want to scratch the surface of, but it's kind of interesting because you would think that a community, I'm not sure if there's any other community that is like more targeted and gets more harassment than the trans community, right? And yet we have, on the top level of Street Fighter, we have trans players playing, right? Somehow, for a group that you can really argue like has a lot of harassment problems, somehow these players can compete, and they are being respected, and like a lot of people like them. I'm a big fan of Ricky Ortiz, for example, and she gets a lot of support. Obviously, she also has the harassment problem, right? Because, well, if you stand out in any way, you're gonna have haters. You're gonna have haters, and people will try to pull you down as much as possible, and they will try to say the meanest shit to get to you. But as I said, this isn't just a problem for women or for trans players. Anytime you stand out, this is exactly what happens. Anytime you become someone people talk about, you have this problem as well. So it's really important to understand that it's not just because of some kind of property, because of your gender, okay? And I think there's so little discussion about it, and instead I know Sanford Kelly saying, oh, I gotta take a stance, men in the FGC, we have to do better. Like, this virtue signaling is not doing anything. It's literally just, look at me, I'm such a nice person. What the fuck? If anything, it's actually hurting the FGC, because, like, what kind of message is this telling any female player that is even remotely interested in the FGC? The message is, don't come to our event, like, don't bother being part of the community, because it's such a toxic place, you're gonna get harassed, so don't even bother. Is that the message that we wanna put forward to female players? I think that's not the right thing to do. And this really comes back, now we're basically getting back to this idea why this is bad to have like a female league. We already have female players that are doing just fine in the FGC, and it's a slap in the face to competitive female players. It's a slap in the face to them. There are women who are physically strong as men when they take steroids. Well, yeah, obviously, because that's exactly what what kind of comment is that? His intention was right. I don't think his intention was right, Super Pats. I think his intention was to get likes and retweets and followers out of it. Who's benefiting from making a tweet like that? Certainly not the women who are harassed. It's just clout farming. You're just trying to get likes and followers. It's like the most egocentric thing that you can do. It's not the right intentions. Simp points, it's exactly the same thing. Actually, like, obviously, being like simping is not the same thing. And really, what it really is, it's disrespectful to women to tweet like that, because you're not taking them seriously. You're putting them in a special shell to protect them from the outside world. I don't think any human should do that. If we want to have a community that is welcome to anyone, no matter what the gender is, we can't do that. Like, we can't have people be treated differently based on gender. I don't see like, this is always like a paradox that you have to solve. You have like a minority group in a community that you think is not doing too great, even though it might just be a difference in interest, which there are a lot of strong arguments to back that up, including my own experience on YouTube. And then you're gonna treat them differently based on their gender, and at the same time you're telling the outside world that these people shouldn't be treated differently because of their gender. It doesn't work that way. You can't say, hey, we need to be specially protective of women in the FGC, and then at the same time say, well, we shouldn't treat women differently. But here's the thing. This isn't an easy topic to talk about, and there are a lot of different angles, right? I'm not telling you guys that, oh, I'm perfectly correct. It's a very complicated topic, and you can make perfectly fine argument. Like, for example, I was wondering, for example, we make leagues based on countries all the time. What's the difference there? Why do we even do that? And that was not really easy for me to figure out. Like, doing a league based on country, doesn't that have the same problem? And yet, it's not considered a problem, right? Women should have their own league and men should have their own. What's the problem? The problem is the women that are actually competitive. Here's the thing. That's actually not a bad question, Saps. It's not a bad question to ask, right? Because you can ask the same question based on country. We do leagues based on country all the time. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody says, oh, I'm being excluded, right? Nobody does that. But why? Why is that acceptable? And It's really something to think about. Yeah, it could be a logistical thing, but people are really interested who's the best player out of a certain country, right? Even if it's like online. For example, the Stalagmite League started out as a German-only thing, and nobody complained about discrimination there, right? The Stalagmite League was opened up to all of the European players. So it's not just like, oh, it's because there are certain boundaries that are, well, bound to happen. There are things that are actually avoidable, and yet, even if they happen, we're okay with that. We're okay with a league that is to figure out who's the best player in a certain country. We are okay with that, right? And I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's the difference between that and, well, having a league specifically for women? As I said, there are a lot of different angles. I guess the final note that I want to hit on, because this is an argument, there's an argument that I hear all the time about this that I think is really weak, and I want to point that out. For example, we have a woman in the FGC that makes this point, or likes to make this point, and I want to counter the argument. So she, shout outs to Nurkromina, she's also a great player. It's really nice to have her transition from the Street Fighter 4 to Street Fighter 5 community finally. She makes the argument that, well, if you're a man, how are you supposed to be able to tell whether a woman has the same problems as a man? Since you literally cannot know what her struggle is because you're not a woman, right? It makes no sense to even discuss it at all, because you're not in a position where you can understand it, right? And here's the thing, it's kind of true. I mean, she makes a valid point right there, right? Because it is true. I'm not a woman, so how would I be able to tell what her struggles are, right? But at the same time, the argument, if that's true, then it really annihilates any basis for any kind of discussion. Because I can use that same argument to her, right? I can flip it around and say, well, how do you know as a woman what kind of struggle a man has to go through? So you can just use the same argument to really make any point. And this is a point that I also that I hear all the time, by the way. Well, you're not in my position, so you can't know the struggle. This is something I hear all the time, and it's really a weak argument because it applies to everyone all the time, right? It is true, but at the same time, this is why we have discussions, right? Why do we have discussions? We have discussions because we want to be able to take a look at a topic or a problem from a different perspective. That's the reason discussions happen. And that's the reason why they're so valuable, because they give you a window to take a look at a different perspective. So yeah, that's something that I want to point out, which I feel like is really interesting. It's really important to point out. And I think the perfect example of that, of why it's so problematic to have this view, is this right there. The Guild Wars 2 developer that responded in such a toxic manner because she couldn't handle her viewpoint being criticized in a very polite way, right? And like responding in such a toxic way, I can't imagine. Like your whole worldview has to be you have to be completely obsessed about the idea that you're being oppressed by men. You have to internalize that. And the moment you do that, you can't have a conversation with a man anymore. Because every time you have any kind of negative interaction, even if it's just a normal conversation, and the person, even if the person is super polite to you, you're gonna completely lose it. I think that's dangerous. And I really think that's dangerous in general, that we putting this idea forth that, oh, as a woman, it's okay to completely be toxic to men. It completely annihilates the discussion portion. We need to be able to talk about topics. We need to be able to do that. And I see this all the time when people are like, oh, the FGC is so toxic. Oh, I'm so embarrassed to be a man. Like whenever I read that tweet, I'm like, what the fuck are you even talking about? Like genuinely, I'm asking myself if it's not just to show, oh, look at me, I'm such a nice person, right? Like, why are people not, like, if it happens so often and so frequently, it's kind of rare to actually hear about harassment from within the FGC. Like, first of all, because we barely have any women, right? So there can't be a lot of harassment. And And when it happens, it's always being reported on. It always is reported on because it's a standout moment, and it's a problem. It's a very prominent problem that people like to talk about. So it immediately gains traction when you talk about it. So yeah, I think this is a really toxic mindset when we teach players that women are being super oppressed within the FGC. I think it does not help women at all. This women's league, I think, is going to create more problems for them than anything else, because people are going to feel justified in their assumptions about really any woman competing. Well, yeah, you're just a woman. You can't compete with the real players, right? I think that's a real problem because it enforces the stereotype even more on them. And on top of that, it's a complete slap in the face to competitive female players. Like, if you're a woman in really any competitive environment, not just the FGC, and you get your own little league because people don't take you seriously and are not expecting you to do well in, well, the big boys league, right? Then, well, that's an insult. In any case, that's gonna be it for my portion. I'm actually running super late, and my wife is probably really mad at me, but she's not saying anything because it's my birthday. I think eventually there's going to be a part 2 of this discussion. I have a lot to say on this, and maybe I'm going to do a YouTube video that is like more organized and more straight to the point. I want to finally talk about it though, and give you my perspective on the situation, because I do feel it's an important topic. It's a very important topic, and I think the community is not handling it very, very well. But at the same time, I'm kind of scared to talk about it because I feel like unless you go all in on the super simplistic view and the super, like, oh, we need to protect women in the FGC, unless you say, like, really, like, oversimplified, and unless you virtual signal all the time, I'm kind of scared about my channel as a result. And people are going to be like, oh, Jimmy, he's oppressing women with his comments. People are gonna be like that. I'm like, what the fuck, dude? No. Kayane makes some really bad statements from time to time that I disagree with. I mean, that's my opinion, obviously, right? But she's, in my opinion, guilty of exactly this. Like, when she reads a mean comment, she points it out on Twitter, and she makes the problem even worse for herself because she's inviting more comments like that because she's insecure about it. And what she doesn't realize is, because she's a known figure in the community, she has haters just like myself. I get mean comments all the time. Imagine if I tweeted out a comment all the time, oh, take a look at this guy, he's so mean to me, oh, that really hurt me. I'm gonna get 10 times the hate if I do that. So this is something I'm bothered by Kayane's tweet. I feel like not only does she not realize that everyone has haters if they're known, but she's also doing the FGC a disservice because she's showing the female communities, she's showing the female players that they should be scared to enter the FGC, when I don't think this is actually true. If you're a female player and you like to play fighting games, if you like to play Street Fighter, you're invited just like everybody else. And I think that's an important message to point out. The FGC is a welcoming place. It absolutely is. And I don't like people pointing out, I mean, you should, if something bad happens and you're a female player, you should absolutely talk about it, because that's not okay. It's not okay to get harassed, obviously, right? We need to talk about that, and that needs to be put forward. And people who, whenever that happens, people should be banned from events and stuff like that. I'm absolutely in favor of that. But when people like start to like just virtual signal all the time and say, oh, this is so bad, the FGC is so bad, without like putting even any example out there, or like without actually trying to make the problem better, right? That's something I'm really not happy about. I have a tweet that I could show, but I didn't prepare it properly. Somebody tweeted at her that she's not really a good player or something like that. Something like that. It was actually a pretty harmless tweet, to be honest. And she tweeted about it and felt so hurt by that comment. And I think she's doing herself and the FGC a disservice by just showing a random hate comment. Because I don't think that's the problem. You're gonna have haters. You always will have haters, and they will always pick the dumbest shit to criticize you. And if you're a woman in the FGC, they will criticize you and will say that you're a bad player because you're a woman, because they try to get to you.